Archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. If it's truth you're interested in, Dr. Tyree's philosophy class is right down the hall. So forget any ideas you got about lost cities, exotic travel, and digging up the world. We do not follow maps to buried treasure, and X never, ever marks the spot.
From the Ear to There Travel Studio, this is the Ear to There Disney Podcast.
The Ear to There Podcast, it's time to start the show. Be sure to hold on tight, here we go. Exploring all the different Disney destinations. Ear to There, it's time to start the fun.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Ear to There Disney Podcast, Walt Disney World Word of the Week. I am your host, Phil Groundlick. I am also the owner and the founder of Ear to There Travel, which is a Disney specialized travel agency. Now, on the Word of the Week shows, I will bring you a different Walt Disney World word each week, and then give you background, history, tips, tricks, all kinds of stuff about that word. This is what I'm really excited about. This week's Walt Disney World, or Disneyland, Word of the Week is brought to you by the letter L. L for lost. And as you may have guessed from the clip that I played at the beginning of this show, this has nothing to do with the old TV show on ABC, Lost, by the way, which was one of my favorite all-time shows, until the end. Like, they were in purgatory the whole, They told us it wouldn't be heaven and hell. I don't know. Anyway, this has nothing to do with that show. What it does have to do with is Indiana Jones and the Lost Expedition. Listen, if this is your first time listening to the show, you may not know that I am a huge Indiana Jones fan. Huge. Like way bigger than Star Wars for me. Indiana Jones was the ultimate hero, still is the ultimate hero. I once went to a movie theater not that long ago, maybe 7 years ago. And my brother and I went because he's also a big Indiana Jones fan. And we went to watch all 4 Indiana Jones movies in a marathon on the big screen. Now, I wanted to watch all 4, but he made me leave after Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He always says that Kingdom of the Crystal Skull doesn't count. Listen, I like that one. I don't love it. It's not as good as any of the original 3. But as I always say, like the Star Wars movies, any time that I can spend an hour and a half to 2 hours, 2 new hours with a character that I love, then it's worth it for me. Anyway, ramble. What am I talking about? What is Indiana Jones and the Lost Expedition? Well, you are so lucky you are here right now because I am going to tell you. But before we get into it, let's use another 80s film franchise and a vehicle and jump in the DeLorean and go back to the 80s. Raiders of the Lost Ark was a huge hit. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was another big hit, the sequel, of course. There was a 3rd movie coming, which of course turned out to be Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. The franchise was as big as it ever was going to get. And Disney already had a great collaboration or a great relationship with George Lucas. He had worked on 1986's Captain EO, and in 1987 he worked on Star Tours, of course. So this was the perfect time for Disney Imagineers and George Lucas to collaborate once again, and Imagineers were tasked with creating an attraction for Adventureland in Disneyland. Now this was the late 1980s and around the same time when Splash Mountain was also being designed for the park. So the Imagineers went to work, and what they came back with wasn't just one attraction. It was actually a very large area that would contain multiple attractions and alter the entire landscape of Adventureland. One of the attractions that was in the plans was a Jeep-style attraction, and this was going to be a dark ride that explored Indiana Jones' most harrowing and most dangerous adventures. There was even going to be a boulder from Raiders of the Lost Ark included in the attraction. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Disneyland and have ridden Indiana Jones and the Temple of the Forbidden Eye in Adventureland, you already have kind of an idea of what the proposed Jeep attraction would morph into in later years. So the Jeep attraction was one of the attractions The other one that was going to be a new attraction was going to be a Minecart roller coaster attraction. So if you've seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, the big finale, one of the biggest scenes in the entire movie is where the mine cars or the ore mining cars kind of race through the temple. Of course, the bad guys are chasing Indy and Short Round and Willie Scott through the temple on the mining cars. If you haven't seen it, I mean, really, what are you doing with your life? You have to stop listening to this podcast right now and go watch Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and watch that scene because it's one of my favorites. And I remember as a kid watching that scene and being like, this should be a roller coaster somewhere. This needs to be a ride. This needs to be somewhere. And of course, Disneyland and the Imagineers were going to build it. And this roller coaster attraction, along with the Jeep attraction, would both be indoors inside this huge temple. So you need to walk into this huge crumbling temple in order to access the queues for both of these attractions. So this show building, this temple, was going to be so big that it was actually going to be perched along the waters of the Jungle Cruise. Outside of this giant temple would be archaeology equipment, excavation equipment, scaffolding, jeeps, all kinds of really cool stuff that would immerse guests in the world of Indiana Jones before you even got inside the temple. And again, this temple was going to be so big that the Jungle Cruise the boats from the Jungle Cruise would actually travel through it. So now if you've ever been on the Jungle Cruise in Disneyland, you know that it's a little bit shorter than it used to be. And then they took a little bit out so that the queue for Indiana Jones and the Temple of the Forbidden Eye could go through there. Of course, the Forbidden Eye attraction was built in the 90s. These plans go back to the 80s. But even now, the Jungle Cruise boats go past that queue. You can actually see into the queue of the current Indiana Jones attraction from the boats on the Jungle Cruise. Now, here's something that Jungle Cruise and Disneyland purists might not really like to hear, but the Jungle Cruise was going to be re-themed and elements of Indiana Jones were going to be added to the attraction itself. And this is where I'm up in the air. While I would have loved having this attraction or these attractions built, I don't know how cool I am with changing Jungle Cruise. I know it might happen eventually, especially with the new Jungle Cruise movie now coming out in the summer of 2021. But I love the idea of the Jungle Cruise being just like, or very close to, the way Walt left it when he passed away. And again, the footprint of this thing was so darn big that the Walt Disney World Railroad would have to pass right through the temple as well. Now, the clean, shiny Walt Disney World Railroad vehicles don't really jive, or they don't really fit in the beat-up kind of jungle world of Indiana Jones. So the idea was that the train would be perched up in the rafters, and guests really couldn't see it from inside the temple, but guests who were riding on the railroad would be able to see down into the temple, see the guests below, and see the attractions below. Now, what I really like about the railroad passing through was from the railroad rider perspective, you would have been riding on a rickety old kind of groaning wooden bridge through the temple. I imagine that idea and that concept kind of made its way over to the Disney's Animal Kingdom and Kilimanjaro Safaris when you ride across that old bridge over the alligator enclosure, and it rocks and it shakes and it makes the noises. I love that part. Anyway, I know what you're saying to yourself right now. You're saying, Phil, this sounds amazing. I hope you're saying this. I am a huge Indiana Jones fan. Why wasn't this built? Well, like I said earlier on in the episode, as this concept, as these attractions were being designed, Splash Mountain was also being designed for the park. The Disney CEO at the time, of course, was Michael Eisner. And I've told the story on the podcast before, but I'll tell it a little bit again. Michael Eisner fell in love with the idea of Splash Mountain, right? Because Michael Eisner always loved synergy. And a competing team of Imagineers was designing this big mountain attraction that would go into Frontierland. And there was a big splash at the end. Of course, when the attraction was Splash Mountain was being designed, Tony Baxter, the head Imagineer on the attraction, had called it its working name of Zippity River Run. But when Michael Eisner got to look at it, he said, hey, wait a minute. We have this movie coming out with Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah. It's called Splash. what if we make this attraction a mountain and call it Splash Mountain? Of course, there's that synergy there because the movie's coming out and now you tie it a little bit loosely to the attraction that's coming out around the same time in Disneyland. His mind was made up. Eisner decided to go with Splash Mountain, and Indiana Jones and the Lost Expedition was placed on the shelf. But all wasn't lost. Haha. See what I did there? Okay. I do crack myself up. Anyway, like I've said on the podcast a bunch of times before, great ideas and great concepts are never forgotten. They're never lost at Disney. So when it was time to build an attraction in Disneyland Paris, they dusted off the old mine train ore mining cars and they built, and I'm going to butcher this, okay? So please, my French speaking listeners, just give me a break. They opened Indiana Jones et le Temple du Peril. Yep, that's my French, in Disneyland Paris. And like I said, the attraction looks a little bit like that planned roller coaster for Adventureland in Disneyland, but there's a couple of big changes. The attraction doesn't take place inside, it's mostly outside. And the biggest change is it's called Indiana Jones, but there's not a ton of Indiana Jones on the attraction. As my friend Victoria mentioned on the Disneyland Paris episode a few episodes ago, it's called Indiana Jones, but it doesn't really feel like Indiana Jones. Anyway, that's where that concept went. And of course, in 1995, Disneyland opened the attraction that I had mentioned a couple times already, Indiana Jones and the Temple of the Forbidden Eye. And like I said, instead of having the Jungle Cruise go through this attraction, it kind of goes around it. But all of Disneyland's Adventureland was rethemed, kind of retrofitted to fit into a 1930s theme. So it fits the timeline of Indiana Jones. And actually, just to give my opinion, I love Disneyland's Adventureland. Now, maybe a big reason is because it doesn't have the magic carpets of Aladdin spinning around in the middle of it. I can never give it up. Maybe that's why, but I just love the overall look and the feel, and it just feels like an Indiana Jones land to me, and it also still has a lot of that charm that was there when Walt was around. Now, the closest that Indiana Jones and the Lost Expedition ever got to truly being built is in Tokyo Disney Sea. Tokyo Disney Sea has a replica, like down to the square inch, of Indiana Jones and the Forbidden Eye from Disneyland. And right next to it, right next door, is a replica, a copy of Disneyland Paris's minecart coaster. But of course, the one in Disneyland Paris, the coaster there, does not mention and is not themed around Indiana Jones. Now, I would love to see an Indiana Jones attraction come to Walt Disney World. And I know we have the stunt show. It's been there since the very, very early days of Disney MGM Studios. But how cool would it be to finally have an attraction, a ride, where you can sit and for 3 or 4 minutes, you can actually be immersed, kind of like Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run or Rise of the Resistance, where you could be immersed into the world of Indiana Jones. And that is going to do it for this week's episode of the Walt Disney World, or Disneyland, Word of the Week. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I really, really loved reading and researching and figuring out how to get this one out to you. Nothing to me beats Indiana Jones. So if you did enjoy it, do me a favor, please tell someone about it. Do you have an Indiana Jones fan? Do you have an Indiana Jones and a Disney Parks fan together rolled into one? If you do, I think they would really enjoy this episode. I hope they would. Listen, I don't know. We're just doing what we can, right? Just tell them about it. Tell them about this episode. I'd really, really appreciate it. Just remember, there will be a new episode of the Word of the Week and a new Here to There Disney podcast next week. So until next time, thank you again so much for listening. Have an amazing week. Bye-bye.
Here to there.